Hey, and welcome to the first episode of our new video card series. So about a year ago, I was reminiscing about LAN parties and old hardware, and I started thinking about a collection. But what PC hardware would be the best? It then occurred to me there's really only one computer part synonymous with gaming, and that would be the video card, or the graphics processing unit, or GPU, or whatever you want to call it. But the point was, that's where I'd start. Video cards are also great for a collection because each one has a unique design and they look great on a shelf. Not to mention every one of the cards released means something to the gamers that have used them. Not only with the memories that we have gaming on them, but also the time and generation of games they represent. For instance, not many other cards and games can be connected quite as well as the GeForce 8800 series, and the game that created the legendary question, but can it run Crysis? The cool thing about these cards in particular, and a reason why I don't have any older than a certain point, is that they are all PCI Express, instead of the older AGP or ancient PCI standards. And since PCIe is backwards compatible, you can, in theory, use any card no matter the age in any computer with a non-proprietary PCIe support, granted that it has a slot of a new enough generation. So what does that all mean, especially to those of you who may not be as well versed in video card specifications? Well, it means I can take a brand new gaming rig, one like mine chock full of RGB and a brand new Ryzen 3600, and 16 gigabytes of DDR4, and slot in a card designed in 2001 with only 64 megabytes of video memory and actually play some games. Granted, there are some limitations. Well, an increasing amount of limitations each year, to be honest, both with DirectX and shader model version support. But the amazing thing here is that it's possible. So, we're going to go back to the beginning in this episode, and to do that we have to travel back to the early 2000s.
This chip could help us heal across continents. We could touch more lives. Help people live longer than ever, and give us all more time to cherish the journey's truest rewards. But then we thought, hey, let's use it for games.
3DFX PC accelerators. So powerful, it's kind of ridiculous.
A time where the Y2K scare had just ended, and the GPU market was shifting away from numerous offerings from companies like 3DFX, Matrox, and S3, and the battle between red and green began to solidify. At this time it was still ATI versus Nvidia, as AMD had yet to acquire ATI. As competition between ATI and Nvidia heated up, it seemed that there wasn't much they could agree on, between each other or even other companies like 3DFX, which Nvidia ended up acquiring in 2000. But there was one thing, that the future of the graphics interface was PCI Express. Although even this they couldn't completely agree on, as ATI decided to natively support the new interface and produce both AGP and PCIe cards, whereas Nvidia opted to install a bridge that would convert existing AGP units to the new PCIe. This brings us to these cards, the ATI R300 chip series, the third generation of Radeon cards released in 2002 as the 9000 series with AGP 8X, then later in 2004 rebranded with the new PCI Express interface you see here. Here we have the X300 entry level in 64 and 128 megabyte flavors, and the mid-tier X600, which we'll be focusing on today. Like I previously stated, the X series were essentially rebranded and nearly identical to the existing 9550 and 9600 cards, the only difference being native PCI Express instead of AGP. This particular card is an X600 Pro, released in 2004 with the smaller 110nm RV370 Harry chip, instead of the larger RV380 Vishnu at 130nm. It has the larger 256 megabytes of DDR VRAM, this card being released about a year before GDDR would be implemented, a 400 MHz core clock, 300 MHz memory, bandwidth around 9 gigabits per second with a bus width of 128, 75 million transistors, 4 pixel, 2 vertex shaders, and finally support for PCIe 1.1 and DirectX 9. Whew. That's the technical specs out of the way, but there are a couple other interesting things to note about the X600 and this actual card. First off, remember those limitations we mentioned earlier? Well, later in the video, we're going to put this card to the test in some older games and some newer titles, but here lies a slight problem. Cards from this series only support DirectX 9 and below, so there's no DX10 or 11 support here. But that's not too big of a limitation, as there's a giant library of DX9 titles and plenty of games that run a newer version and can also be set or forced to run at DX9. The second and more debilitating limitation is that the X series is also only capable of shader model 2, whereas a lot of newer DX9 titles require version 3. But not all of them. Yes, that was foreshadowing. Next! The last interesting piece of information about this card that you might notice just by looking at it, it doesn't seem like it will fit into a normal slot. And the DVI slot, well, that isn't exactly DVI, is it? No, in fact, this card, like many of the X series that were manufactured, were done so specifically for use in Dell computers. And the connector seen here is something called DMS59, named for the number of pins the connector has. The solution to this is an adapter from DMS59 to the standard DVI connection. But here's something of a unique advantage over DVI you can see here in the adapter. DMS59 is capable of high-resolution dual output, so a half-height card like this can natively support output to 2 monitors from a single port. If I had a full-size, 4 outputs from just a single card would be possible. All the cards that will be featured in this series are of course used and have made their way to me in various conditions. Some really nice and clean, well maintained, others really gross and filled with all sorts of nastiness. So we're going to do a teardown and some minor refurbishment by cleaning the card and reapplying thermal paste. And you're going to see that now, sped up for time constraints, but I will be putting the full section with the teardown, walkthrough, and cleaning in a separate video later if you want to check that out. Alright, now we're going to get into the cool stuff. Installing and seeing what this card can do. So we're going to try installing on my computer first. I have a couple test beds of various ages, 2 Ryzen PCs, a DDR3 generation, a DDR2 gen that's set up here with Windows 7 as a fallback, and something we'll explore in a future video that you may have noticed in our trailer. So my computer that we'll use has an ASRock B450 Steel Legend motherboard with the most recent BIOS, a brand new Ryzen 3600, 16GB of Corsair 3200MHz RGB Pro RAM, an M.2 NVMe SSD, and a GTX 1070 Ti that will obviously be replaced with our little X600. Okay, so now we have the card physically installed, we need to go ahead and install the drivers now. Alright, so you're going to want to go to AMD's website, then click on Drivers and Support, scroll down and click on Graphics. There's going to be a list of their cards, go to the bottom and click the Legacy Graphics. Then we want to select Radeon X series and look for the X600 we have. Go ahead and click Submit, and since we have Windows 10, we'll want to get the most recent drivers that we can. So let's go for Windows Vista 64-bit. Now we could get the entire Catalyst suite, but for our purposes it's not really necessary. The base drivers will do. Alright, so we have them downloaded. We'll go ahead and run them as administrator like usual. Now this directory is important. We'll use it in a sec, but for now just hit install. Alright, and now the most important step. We don't actually want to use the installer. We have the files that we need extracted to manually install the drivers. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and switch over to the camera since I can't install the rest of the drivers and record the desktop at the same time. Open your device manager from your start menu. Then look under display adapters for Microsoft Basic Adapter. If it shows up correct as an X series card, you can either leave it or right click and uninstall first. Now click Update Driver and choose Browse. Make sure you point it to your ATI folder, check subfolders, and then hit Next. The drivers will now correctly install. And we're good to go. If we just check out display resolution, we can now get up to 1920 by 1080. Alright, we should be good to go. Let's go try some games. So we're going to switch to the camera view again for the best possible performance, and OBS unfortunately doesn't function with really old cards. Alright, we're going to start in 2002 with Battlefield 1942, a game that the X600 should be able to tackle pretty well, considering it came out 2 years before the card. The game is set to max settings and is running at 1080p, but as you can see it's hovering right above 20 FPS, which isn't great but understandable. That's a common trend you'll see with this card and others from its era, an inability to tackle high resolutions nearly as well as 720p or below. This could be due to the lack of good texture processing that was notable even at the time for this series, or perhaps its slower DDR VRAM instead of GDDR, bottlenecking the card, or maybe the 256MB simply isn't enough, even though that was the highest available. We'll be able to test that theory a bit more with the 64MB X600 SE in the next video. Now we've switched to 720p, and the performance increase is considerable. More than double the FPS, fluctuating between 40 and 60. So we're not going to mess with the settings on this game, or really with any that were released around the same time as this card, especially if we can reach a target of 60 FPS. However, we are going to give it every chance to, so let's drop the resolution to 480p. Alright, now we're well above 100 FPS. You could almost even get the full benefit of my 144Hz monitor at this resolution. There are also some micro stutters. That's another thing you sometimes notice on this card with either high resolution or high frame rate. All in all, decent performance, definitely playable. Alright, on to the next game. This is Battlefield Vietnam, the next in the series and my favorite one. Many hours of bot stomping with my friends took place in 2004 when it was released. This game seems to run a little better than 1942 at higher resolutions for some reason. 1080p highest, and we're staying around 20 to 30. – 720p, 50 to 70 FPS. Finally, 480p is kinda all over the place, reaching 200 FPS and dropping down to 70 occasionally. Now we're gonna give it a bit more of a challenge. Crytek's predecessor to Crysis, the original Far Cry. In 2004, this was almost as much of a video card killer as its younger brother, but without the reputation. 1080p highest, and you can see exactly what I mean, not even able to squeeze out 10 FPS. 720p is better, but similar and not really playable, staying around 15 FPS. So let's drop the settings to lowest and try again. At 1080p it seems a lot better until we step outdoors and drop below 15 frames. 720p is much better, hitting 70 FPS but still dropping to 30. Far Cry would be best enjoyed on this card at 800 by 600 or lower, keeping the lowest settings. Moving on to Unreal Tournament 2004, we have to run the game in windowed mode, as full screen seems to cause artifacting for some reason. Leaving the settings on highest, we stay around 15 FPS at 1080p. Dropping to 720p, we see a more playable 30 to 35. 480p gives us almost exactly double, averaging 70 FPS. The scaling in this game seems spot on. The Source engine remains to this day one of the best scaling game engines, and Counter-Strike Source is the best example of that on this card. We'll start on highest 1080p. Unfortunately, we get just above 10 FPS. 720p sees an increase to the low 20s. And 480p sees double that, with the frame rate sometimes hitting 60 to 70, but averaging about 55. If we drop the settings to low, we get an uptake at 1080p to the high 20s. But it's at 720p we start seeing some nice numbers, with the game staying above 60. 480p gives us a really high frame rate, but with some random stuttering, but staying well above 120 FPS. We're gonna start getting into some newer, more demanding games now, starting with Elder Scrolls IV: Oblivion. Oblivion isn't really playable at any resolution when set to highest, averaging just 4, 8, and 12 FPS on 1080, 720, and 480p. Things don't get a lot better when we drop them to low either, getting just a couple more frames at 1080p. So we're gonna have to take some drastic measures, setting everything to their absolute lowest, which means some of the view distances are effectively set to 0. This, however, leaves us with a strange, surreal landscape. With no grass and two-dimensional trees popping in, it looks more like an old screensaver than a game. But I guess now we're getting above 20 FPS. So what if we set the distances to just above the minimums? Well, now we get some grass, exactly 10 feet of it, but the FPS drops again to below 10. If we repeat those steps at lower resolutions, that's where we finally start to see some playable frame rates, although the game isn't really comfortably playable at any setting. Even at 480p, bringing the view distances up to a more reasonable level tanks our FPS to below 20. Seems like Oblivion's grass rendering just doesn't play well with our X600. BioShock is one of those games that we have to get running by forcing the game into DirectX 9 mode. While the game does start up, unfortunately, no matter what setting we use, nothing really gets rendered except some completely white parts and for some reason the sparks in the bathysphere when it's getting attacked by a splicer. This is probably caused by the lack of Shader Model 3 support. This unfortunately means that we also can't try the 2016 remaster. The same can be said for Far Cry 2. The game and the benchmark start up, and this time nothing at all is rendered, just a black screen with the game sounds running in the background. Minecraft should be able to run on this card, as it's an OpenGL game, but it simply wouldn't start up, even when trying the original 1.0 version. Unfortunately, the rest of the gaming tests went about the same way, with Skyrim, Far Cry 3, CSGO, Borderlands 2, and Company of Heroes 2 giving missing Shader Model 3 support error messages. So I didn't want to spend too much time on synthetics, and more on trying some actual games. But I did try a few. If you want to see some more benchmark information from either games or synthetic tests, I've done way more in-depth testing previously, that if enough interest was shown, I might spend the time to get those either into videos or some sort of picture database, maybe on Patreon, but as you can imagine, it takes an immense amount of time to do so. Anyway, as you can see, I tried running both Unigine Heaven and their oldest test, Sanctuary, with the same result. The benchmarks do run, but other than statistical data, the output is just rendering artifacts. Other older benchmarks do function, for the most part, including the older 3D marks like 99 through 2006, but anything past 2003 isn't particularly impressive. Well, I guess that's it, right? We did get everything, didn't we? Alright, I'm just messing with you. Of course I didn't forget, but really I do hope most of you are looking forward to this part. The part where we finally answer the question, but can it run Crysis? So, can it? Well, with a little step of adding the DX9 command to the launch target, surely enough the game does start. Due to Crysis limiting out graphics settings to the capabilities of the card though, the maximum setting we can try is lowest. So will the tiny X600, one of the first PCI Express cards to exist, be able to tackle the monolithic Crysis? Looks like the answer is indeed yes. It can definitely run Crysis. Now let's see if it can play Crysis. The lowest resolution, 800 by 600, nets us only 13 FPS, and while Crysis is one of those games that's more playable at low frame rates than any other games, anything much below 20 is still way too low. So let's configure the INI file and manually bump that down to 480p. That seems to give us the few frames more that we needed, staying above 15 FPS. It's not great, and certainly not the best way to play the game, but it does work. I'd be more worried though in the later snow stages, as the particle effects usually cause large losses in performance, even on modern hardware. We'll take one more shot, this time for 1080p for the sake of image quality, and as is expected, it's basically a slideshow, and makes getting into this damn doorway laughably irritating. But we did do it. We answered the question and got one of the most graphically demanding and forward-thinking games of the last decade to run. Pretty impressive considering the card is incapable of even starting a good amount of games released just a few years after it. This is all the proof you really need to tell that Crytek put incredible amounts of work into their engine for this game. It's extremely scalable, and every time I boot it up, I'm reminded that it really does live up to its legendary reputation. So what do I think about ATI's X600? Well, there's the limitations we covered, and it's not the best performer, but for being one of the first graphics cards to support PCI Express, it's still pretty impressive and surprised me, especially running Crysis. It's kind of a funky little card and will retain a great piece of gaming history on my shelf. Well, that's it for this episode. I want to thank you for checking it out and our channel. These videos take a lot of time, and the passion we have for gaming and PC hardware goes into them. If you'd like to support us, please visit our Patreon, consider subscribing for more videos, or give us a like. One of these days I might even be able to replace my old gaming chair. If you have any questions, comments, want to see a certain game be tested with a certain card, be sure to put them below. And if you have any memories or want to reminisce about any of the cards we cover here, we'd love to hear it. Thanks!